Oh, good afternoon, everybody. If everyone is ready, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, my lord.
Recommence, please.
Can I return? Well, can I not return, but can I embark on considering some of the questions that were put to you and which you've answered in your written responses? First of all, you were asked individually to comment on the civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights that a government, such as the Scottish Government, should consider before deciding to impose any NPIs, including blanket restrictions. Now, can I first of all turn to you, Professor Busby, because you have given a fulsome recitation of those rights. Perhaps you could just summarise them, if you would, for the benefit of our audience.
Yes, I will. So the rights, and I will refer to notes here because it's quite a long list here, and I won't do a huge amount of detail on each of them. But the rights under the Convention, so the European Convention on Human Rights, are incorporated into UK law by the Human Rights Act 1998, and they wouldn't all necessarily be engaged. But in my answer, I tried to think of, in the broader sense, which ones might have particular relevance. So the right to life, Article 2. Prohibition of torture, Article 3. Here I was thinking about the safeguarding of the human rights of people with mental disorder. If, for example, greater power was placed in the hands of professionals, there were lower levels of scrutiny and the potential for significantly increased periods of detention and restriction of autonomy. The prohibition of slavery and forced labour, Article 4. And here we might think about victims of modern slavery and human trafficking during lockdowns or other measures with less scrutiny than usual, perhaps. The right to liberty and security, Article 5. The right to a fair trial and the no punishment without law, Articles 6 and 7. Again, very broadly conceived, we might be thinking about the use of paper trials or online hearings for some vulnerable groups which reduce participation. And then the right to respect for private and family life, Article 8. Freedom of thought, conscience and religion, Article 9. Freedom of expression, Article 10. Freedom of assembly and association, Article 11. Prohibition of discrimination, Article 14. And the right to education, which is covered under Protocol number 1, Article 2. This is subject in the UK to a reservation, though, that the right is accepted only insofar as it is compatible with the provision of efficient instruction and training and the avoidance of unreasonable public expenditure. So some of these rights are allow for no limitations, they're absolute. Examples of that would be the right to life, Article 2, and freedom from torture and slavery, Articles 3 and 4. But most human rights are not absolute and can be restricted, albeit within certain limits. And then we have in Scotland incorporated the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a UN convention which provides for a range of economic, social and cultural rights for children and young people. It's directly incorporated into Scots law since 2024, but it is subject to certain constraints because of the devolution arrangements. And that gives rights to education, Articles 28 and 29, rights to support in the context of domestic abuse, Articles 19 and 39 might be relevant there. And then there are, I won't go into detail here, but there are a range of human rights treaties that the UK has ratified. And of particular relevance there, just because of policy developments in Scotland, are the plans to incorporate, the Scottish Government, I should say, plans to incorporate the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, CEDAW, which is the treaty which gives rights to women in particular respects, ICERD, which gives rights on grounds of race and nationality and ethnicity, and the UNCRPD, which provides a range of rights to do with disability for disabled people. And these are economic, social and cultural rights, and the Scottish Government's plans to incorporate those into Scots law, if they do indeed come to fruition, are still under review, so still unconfirmed what that will mean. There's a combination being proposed of a a direct incorporation in the form of a compliance duty of some of those rights, and then the use of positive duties, which place certain duties on public authorities to give active consideration to the group protections, for example, in CEDAW, CERD and the CRPD. But we don't know yet what that will look like, or if in fact it will happen, because of course there are Scottish elections pending and we don't yet have a bill in process. So I think probably I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. I'm going to actually take another question directed to you. You've made reference to the various conventions that you referred to. If one looks at the situation in respect of a potential pandemic, are these rights as articulated in these various conventions, are these rights that the Scottish Government should take into account?
I would say they are rights that the Scottish Government should take into account, not just because of the compliance argument, and lots of these rights, as I've said, in the UN treaties, for example, aside from the UN CRC, are not directly incorporated, so they don't give rise to rights which can be used as the basis for cases before the Scottish courts and tribunals. But I would argue that human rights treaties, once ratified, do place certain obligations on duty bearers, including the executive and parliament, to respect, protect and fulfil those rights, and the human rights of individuals under those treaties. Further than that, the Scottish Government says that it adopts a human rights-based approach in its policy making, and that requires broad consideration to be given to the wider human rights framework, including economic, social and cultural rights contained in those treaties and the principles that underpin them, so dignity, non-discrimination and so on. An example of this is that Public Health Scotland has adopted what's called the AAAQ framework, which refers to availability, accessibility, acceptability and quality, which actually originates from the international human rights law framework, specifically the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and is aimed at providing specific standards for fulfilling human rights obligations, such as the right to health. So given all of that, I think human rights serve not just as tools for hard compliance, which might be difficult in all sorts of respects, but they also provide us with a framework for behaviour, and having ratified those treaties on economic, social, cultural rights, I think that governments and others are bound by them to a certain extent, yet certainly in decision-making on things like, how to plan for, or how to operate certain public services in the context of a national health emergency.
Does this possibly merge into or morph into the question of ethical considerations rather than strictly legal considerations?
Yes.
Would that be a way of looking at that?
Yes, I think that is a clear way of looking at that. And actually, we do see lots of overlap between the ethical provision and the kind of hard law provision. I mean, these treaties have developed, and the international human rights framework has developed due to a certain degree of consensus between states about how we want to live, as a human race, and the sorts of things that we hold as important and valuable in that kind of assessment. And so, yes, these are ethical considerations, I think. So even without hard legal compliance, which isn't always there, isn't always possible, and isn't always particularly useful, I think that they should be, if you like, a guiding framework, which would be an ethical framework, yes.
Can I ask you further, is there, as far as you're aware, any current pushback against consideration of these ethical rights, so far as governments within the UK are concerned?
There is lots of pushback on human rights generally, on the kind of commitment to human rights, what they mean, how they ought to be used. There's lots of stuff around, particularly the convention rights, for example, which are incorporated into domestic law, and the way in which the Strasbourg court operates. There's lots there. And we do see increasingly, and it raises its head from time to time and has come back up quite recently, we do see politicians saying, perhaps we should consider leaving the convention, moving away from that external, if you like, decision-making around human rights, and introducing something which is more localized, more settled in or set in domestic law, by way of, for example, a Bill of Rights for the UK or for Scotland or whatever. So yeah, there is pushback. Whether that is in relation to the actual rights themselves or the way in which it is perceived that they operate, I think there's a difference between those two things. I think in terms of social, economic and cultural rights, there probably is broad agreement that these are good things to have, and that the ethics underpinning those rights, or the basis for those rights, are things that we probably mostly agree on as a society. But I think it's lots of the disagreement there comes up, and the pushback there comes up around the way in which they are implemented, particularly where it comes to what you might call the kind of hard compliance, in respect of how the rights are realised and how courts in particular are charged with doing that. The system there, I think, is certainly open to all sorts of pushback. And
thank you. Can I just ask one further question in relation to that? Obviously, there's a distinction that falls to be drawn between those rights that are, I'll use the term loosely, enforceable within this jurisdiction, and those that are not. From the point of view of acting in accordance with a human rights-based approach, should there be a hard demarcation between those that are enforceable and those that are not?
Yes, there should be, and I think it should be clear what that demarcation is, and how it operates in practice, because it may prevent, or at least it may come into broad considerations of the balancing, if you like, between competing rights, if we're talking about rights which are enforceable, which are justiciable, and the broad kind of ethical framework, which is not. So I think there is a very clear distinction between those things. Yeah.
So far, take one further question on that. Is there, with what you've just said, any suggestion that in decision-making process there should be a distinction made by decision makers on that?
Yes. So there are positive obligations on the state to, for example, to protect people against threats to their health, if we want to use health as an example. And that it's an absolute, as I mentioned, we have the significance of Article 2, is that it is an absolute right, cannot be interfered with by the state, but it doesn't outrank other rights. So I think there is a balancing exercise that needs to be done there. And I think that decision makers do have to take account of things like proportionality and justification when they are making or considering that balancing exercise, engaged in that balancing exercise. And there are certain things under international law that you can do, and certain things that you can't do. Again, it's difficult in a real life situation with, and we talked already this morning about information, sources of information, and information sources revealing themselves in real time. I think it's difficult to take account of all of that in terms of decision making, but certainly there are checks and balances in place which I think should be respected in any decisions that are made. And really they come into play where we might see a decision to prioritise one right, for example, the right to life, over others, because we have to, this is where that balancing act comes in. We have to think about proportionality and justification, not just in relation to preserving the right to life, but in the impact that that decision to prioritise, if you like, that right will have on other rights. So where the rights kind of bump up against each other, those decisions have to be made looking at proportionality and justification in relation to the other rights, which will be restricted because you're prioritising a particular right over another, if that makes sense.
In relation to what Lord Sumption said this morning in relation to the right to health being more a right to be considered as per the Strasbourg jurisprudence under Article 8 rather than Article 2, what's your view on that?
Yes, I mean, I totally agree, obviously, with what Lord Sumption said, that Article 8 has been given more consideration, perhaps in similar contexts, not in the context of pandemics, but in similar contexts to do with national emergencies. But so yes, I think that's right. The jurisprudence is not particularly well developed in the context of what we're talking about today. And I would also say that, again, yes, that would be a matter of sort of hard compliance, because for a case to get to Strasbourg, there are all sorts of other things that have to happen before that stage. But I would think about the observance of these rights and respect for these rights in that broader sense, I suppose, in that kind of ethical framework, as well as in relation to the hard compliance and the jurisprudence that quite rightly Lord Sumption pointed out is unsettled, undeveloped, and not particularly helpful, I think, in this context. But yeah, Article 8 is the one that has been tested more often by the court, or considered more often by the court, but not, I don't really think, in regard to the particular context that we're talking about here.
There seems to be, from my researchers, remarkably little, if any, jurisprudence from either the court or the commission in relation to the COVID pandemic and reaction to it. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, that's correct, as far as I'm aware, yeah.
Lord Sumption, can I come to you? From your perspective, we've heard your comment in relation to health and the Strasbourg jurisprudence. I won't attempt to pronounce the name of this Swiss case, but
it's very long.
I'd noticed. I think it's probably sent our stenographers into meltdown. But I've noted your position on that. Do you have any other comments to make in relation to the way in which, if I can put it, hard human rights law, in the sense of enforceable human rights law, morphs slightly into what might be seen to be as expressions of principle, which don't have the same hard edge to them?
Well, basically, I agree with that way of putting it. The non-incorporated treaties, including non-incorporated human rights treaties, are a relevant consideration. That's to say that a government which took them into account would not be at risk of having taken irrelevant factors into account, provided that it was acting within its statutory powers. So they're relevant but not binding. And I think that's a distinction which is quite important. Secondly, I think that you have to bear in mind that positive rights are subject to a more exacting test in human rights law. The way that it's usually put in decisions of the Strasbourg Court is that a positive right to some particular benefit is only infringed if the infringement infringes the very essence of the right. That's the way that it's put, which is basically a rather jargon-laden way of saying that the infringement of the right must be very significant. It must mean that effectively you are ignoring the right totally, and that is why breaches of positive rights are more difficult to establish than other breaches of negative rights. I mean, finally, I would say this. The margin of appreciation in cases of this kind is likely to be particularly wide for a number of reasons. One is that the court very much prefers to go down routes like Article 8, which allow for conflicting public interests. There are obviously very many considerations in relation to measures of public health, particularly when they involve extremely intrusive measures like lockdowns, which will point the other way. So basically the range of factors is so wide that the element of judgment is bound to be more important. Secondly, some of these factors are actually reflected in other provisions of the Convention, and that, of course, means that inevitably you've got some kind of balancing act, and it has to enlarge the margin of appreciation. Finally, pandemics, although they are international by definition, do not necessarily have the same impact on every society. There are many factors peculiar to particular societies connected with the state of public health, the state of housing, the institutional framework and so on, the availability of public health services and that kind of factor. And for that reason, the most tribunals considering the human rights aspect of this are going to give a very large margin of appreciation to governments which will take account of the particular social factors that are relevant in that country, the sort of factors that were part of the bank of knowledge that we were discussing in a different context this morning. So I think that in practice, although a lot of these rights are, as the phrase goes, engaged, the likelihood that any particular way of dealing with them is going to be held to be a breach of any human rights, let alone a breach of the legally binding terms of the Convention, is small.
Thank you very much. Professor Parker, you've made some comments in your answer about human rights, and I think you come to it by acknowledging that you're not a lawyer and that you're not professing any expertise on this, but you've indicated a number of what one might call some of these softer rights that you feel, from an ethical point of view, are use Lord Sumption's word, engaged to a certain extent. Could you just give us a little flavour of those? And before you do, there is one that we touched on this morning, and I'd like to deal with it a little bit further with you, and that is the question of messaging and the right to be informed. I mean, one can look at this in probably a number of respects, but there is now a well-established concept within medical negligence law of the right to be informed of the potential consequences of any proposed treatment. So, in that context, could you explain from an ethicist point of view where these rights come in and where they sit insofar as decision making is concerned?
Well, thank you for asking. And I'll perhaps, as you said, I can't speak with authority on any of the sort of legal or formal rights instruments, but we've already started to talk about ethics in this space, and perhaps if I start off, then perhaps Professor Wilson might want to add to that. I think thinking about rights is very important, but I think there are a number of other things that are important to pay attention to if we're thinking about the ethical questions arising in these kind of contexts. So perhaps say more about that later. But I think if you think about the places in which ethical questions might arise in relation to something like a lockdown, for example, some of those will arise at governmental level or policymaker level, but some of them will arise at the level of the day-to-day practice of imposing, managing a lockdown. So that some ethical questions will arise, for example, for police officers or for nurses or people running hospitals. So it's important to think about, when we think about ethics, not everything operates at the state level. There's a lot of complexity there. I think another thing to say is probably that resources matter. So if people can only have if we're thinking about rights, it's important, I think, to pay attention to the responsibilities. You know, as you mentioned earlier, who are the duty holders? Who has relevant obligations? I think to speak meaningfully about rights, one needs to speak about responsibilities. Who has them? And what's the nature and scope of those responsibilities? And those will apply in relation to positive rights or negative rights. But people can only meet their obligations if they have the available resources to do so. So that, I think, raises questions if I think about this sort of going from the state level down. So a nurse dealing with a patient or a police officer dealing with a breach of lockdown can only deal with those things in an ethical way if they have the resources, and those might be training, they might be money, they might be staff, there could be a whole range of things. So I think there's a number of ethical questions relating to the kinds of things that need to be in place for rights to be effectively respected. Yeah, I'm trying to think about how to say this without going too much into ethics. But anyway, it strikes me that it's obvious that in many of these decisions, whether it's a lockdown or any other kind of decision, there are inevitably going to be competing obligations, interests, values, and commitments. And so it's very unlikely that all of these are going to pull in the same direction. So that raises, I think, questions about how one goes about making moral judgments or value judgments, and again, in conditions of uncertainty. So it seems to me that's incredibly. There's a sort of procedural ethics here, as it were, to some degree. So how might one go about making these judgments in ways that are thoughtful, structured, accountable, and that then I think raises the question of communication that you just asked me, which is that I do think there are obligations which relate to rights, which relate to these kind of questions on decision makers at all levels to explain the challenges they face and how they've the procedural, as it were, questions of how they've gone through that process of making a decision, and that these might be revisable and criticisable later. What's something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten it. So I'll perhaps. Well, I guess this is a question. Yeah, it comes back to the question about public values and how much they should play into the decisions that actually get made. And we talked about that earlier, the obligations of politicians sometimes to go against what the public would like to see happen. And I think that's true. I think there may well be strong moral obligations to do things that the public don't think are the right thing at the time, or certain groups don't think are. But I think the gap between those two things, this is sort of Bernard Williams' point, I think, the gap between those two things can only stray so far, as it can only grow so big if we're interested in public trust and confidence in decision-making processes and decision makers. So I think we need to pay attention, as it were, to the relationship between the decisions that get made and public views, but they needn't necessarily be the same thing. So perhaps.
Yeah. Can I just stay with you just for a moment, Professor? I picked up the point at 1.5 of your response, where you're talking about beyond legally enforced rights, the various moral rights, and you enumerate some of them, and I picked up particularly on the right to truthful information and to a reasonable explanation of restrictions. And I think you've answered that. I'm interested in your other comments on the rights, again, not legally enforceable, but you refer to as moral rights, to have one's voice heard in a democratic process or in democratic processes, and then to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of legal status. Can I just ask you about your view on the right to be heard in the democratic process? One would think that what you're referring to there is the right through parliamentary representatives to discuss matters in relation to non-pharmaceutical interventions. Is that what you have in mind, or is it a more wider right to have a general public debate about the subject?
I'm thinking more broadly than that. So I'm thinking about the value to the enhancement of decision making by diversity of various kinds, and so that that can mean a whole range of things. But I think it means that at its heart that decision making is improved often by by the bringing to bear on that process of different perspectives, whether those are scientific, methodological, philosophical, political, or societal, cultural perspectives. I think that can enhance the process. But it also operates within the within the democratic process. I mean, obviously there are time pressures, but I think there are obligations on, for example, for ministers to explain to Parliament why they're doing. So that's one version of that, what they're doing, what the considerations are, and so on. But also the wider public, I think, have and diverse perspectives should be brought to bear. Now, of course, that's not simple, and there need to be limits that needs to be managed, because decisions need to be made, and there may well be a tension sometimes between the time it takes to respectfully engage with a wide range of perspectives and the need to make decisions. That shouldn't be an excuse for being overly narrow and excluding voices, but one does obviously have to take account of the pragmatics of the situation, which mean that there's a limit to what one can do. But I think making a serious effort for voices of different. I mean, the voices that are relevant. I'm being a bit vague about that, but the voices that are relevant will differ depending on the nature of the problem, I think. Health professionals, members of the public, people who have relatives in care homes, and so on.
Yeah. So I think it's probably very almost explicit in what you're saying, that individuals will have different perspectives on what needs to be considered in terms of value judgments and ethical considerations.
Well, that's in a sense, this is why ethical problems exist, isn't it? Many of them to do with the fact that there are competing interests or considerations. So that's absolutely right. But I don't. A credible, reasonable, justifiable decision-making process is not going to be one where everyone gets to be heard. That difficult decisions, and this in itself is to some extent a pragmatic process, but to some extent an ethical process question, which is how does one go about doing this in a way that's reasonably inclusive, but nonetheless effective, because the public has a strong interest in decisions being made quickly in some cases, and so one can't wait forever. So there are even at that level there are competing considerations.
Thank you. There's probably, I hesitate to use this expression, but I will. There's probably a slight elephant in the room here, and that's your involvement in the SAGE committee. Your involvement in SAGE, can you indicate to us the extent to which the ethical considerations were considered by SAGE, and whether you felt that was adequate? Yeah.
So just declaring possible conflicts, I suppose. So yes. I was a participant in SAGE. That's the correct term. I was also a member of the Department of Health and Social Care Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, and I was also on a World Health Organization a group. So in relation to SAGE, I was to some extent I was slightly disappointed about we heard about the minutes earlier. I think I think they underplayed the complexity and richness of the discussion in some of those meetings, which I think is a failing. I think that more could have been said about that. I was brought in after that first decision was made about the pandemic, and I think there was some recognition. My invitation made it clear that there was recognition that there was a need for ethics input. I don't think one person is enough, but nonetheless there was at least some recognition that there was a need for a voice in the room. I found it easy, I think, to have my voice heard in those meetings, and there were a couple of ways in which it was difficult for me. So I felt no sense in which my voice wasn't taken as seriously as anyone else's, and I felt that discussions were, there were lots of people on the call, so ethics wasn't always the top thing to talk about, but. Nevertheless, I thought I was taken seriously. Two things. First is this was a scientific advisory committee. So being an ethicist in that setting, I wasn't in the role of advising the government on ethics. I was in a role essentially of sort of helping scientific advisors to think about ethics and to incorporate thinking about ethics into their advice. So it was sort of second hand, as it were. So the role was ambiguous to some extent. And I think the other thing which is apparent perhaps in retrospect rather than at the time, is that if you're an ethicist speaking in that type of situation, you're inevitably raising questions about what ought or ought not to be done in a whole range of ways, and that can sound, if expressed clumsily, sound like one wants to make policy. That's not how I understood my role. My role was essentially analogous to the scientist role, which was to essentially try to help provide decision makers, elected officials and others, to provide them with a toolkit to enable them, if the metaphor works, to enable them to navigate the landscape so help them to understand the value landscape in which they were having to make decisions. So what are the different available courses of action? What are the moral questions that might arise in each of those different routes, and what might be the tensions between them, and what kind of questions policymakers might need to engage with, as it were, if they choose to go down one route or the other. So my aim was to essentially map out a landscape, say, here are the things you will need to think about, and to try to provide some frameworks for thinking about those without, and clearly not, saying you should do this or you should do that. My role was essentially to map out that, which is, it's difficult to do in very busy meetings, where there are lots of other pressures that we've heard about. But that's the role. And if I were to offer advice in relation to that, I do think there is a need. I think it was great that the importance of ethics was recognised, but I think there's a real need for specific, informed, more inclusive ethics advice.
I suppose, again, what you've said does lead to a further question, which you may not be willing or indeed able to answer. But you were heard. Do you think your advice was acted upon?
So, as someone I think mentioned earlier, I can't remember who it was. So, the process essentially, I think it may have been you. The process essentially, you have these discussions, and the relationship with government is essentially managed by those who report from the committee. So that's I haven't been involved in that process, but I imagine that's the chief medical officer, chief scientific advisor, and so on. I felt that I was taken seriously by those who were speaking to government. I felt confident that they knew what I thought were the important issues. I have no idea what happened after that, but I think it would be fair. It would only be fair to say that I thought I was taken seriously and my voice was heard.
Thank you very much. Professor Wilson, could I turn to you, because I think you've made some comments in your response to us in relation to the input of ethical considerations into decision making. Do you agree largely with your colleague Professor Parker in what he's just said, so far as your knowledge is concerned?
Yeah, I would largely agree. I mean, it's one thing that was quite clear is that whereas there's quite a well-established, what I might call a sort of infrastructure for scientific advice, so that every government department has its own chief scientific advisor, they have a team, you have SAGE, and so that there's a sort of process by which scientific issues from particular kind of ministries can bubble up, be thought about by a chief scientific advisor who can advise ministers. And whereas it seemed that when things came to ethics, it was often very much an afterthought. Nobody thought that you needed a kind of dedicated committee for ethics that would be providing advice to ministers. On various occasions, it seemed that ad hoc ethics advice was taken, for example, on decisions around whether to recommend vaccination for children from the JCVI and so on. But that when those decisions were often taken, it was sort of typically sort of in a way that sort of where the decision making was not particularly public. It wasn't sort of the arguments were not sort of expressed in public. For and against. Often people found themselves sort of trying to get access to what had happened via freedom of information and so on. And so that it seems very useful that, that there was at least one ethicist on stage, but that it doesn't maybe suggest that the government as a whole took the questions of values, which, as we've heard already, seem to be at the heart of a lot of the decisions that were taken, the big-scale decisions that were taken during the pandemic. Perhaps they didn't take those as seriously, or they didn't sort of want to have that public debate and to be seen to be offering reasons, or to have had sort of ethical advice and then to be considering that ethical advice. That didn't seem to happen, whereas there are lots of European countries where that did happen in a much more public way. So, for example, when Germany was considering, well, should we put in place something like what was sometimes known as vaccine passports? That's to say, should we allow those who've been vaccinated to have more liberty than in the way that they go about their life than those who haven't? They specifically asked their ethics council, who are sort of established by statute, give us a report on this and we won't make a decision until we've heard what you have to say. And as I understand it, that once the report was delivered, the Chancellor was quite keen to meet with the chair of the council in order to discuss it, to fully understand the reasoning. It doesn't seem that we had anything like that happening in the UK.
You refer in your response, Professor Wilson, at paragraph 2.4, to the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. And you indicate that that was set up in 2019 to provide independent advice to the UK government on, and you quote, moral, ethical and faith considerations on health and social care related issues. That would tend to suggest that that was something or a body which one might expect would be engaged in these decision-making processes. You do go on to say that the pandemic ethical framework was, however, not used by the UK government in articulating rationales around MPIs. And you give us an indication later in your statement in relation to what you say at paragraph 2.6 and footnote 12 about the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, sometimes taken a role to play de facto the role which the National Ethics Committee, but its advice was not sought by the UK government during the pandemic. Indeed, the Nuffield Council, alongside leading public engagement charity Involve, went so far as to write an open letter to the UK Prime Minister calling for greater transparency, urging that the government set out the ethical considerations that were informing judgments. Now, you then give us the reference to that document so that parties can see that document. And your final comment on that was the letter was not answered. Now, can I just understand what we should take from that? So far as the fact, as it would appear that you wrote together with Involve to highlight various matters, and there wasn't an apparent response. Did that give you any indication of or did that inform your view on the extent to which your contribution was being taken seriously?
I should say that particular letter was written by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and by Involve, the charity. I wasn't a member of either of those, but I noted the fact that that the Nuffield Council on Bioethics is very well established, and for example, there's a world meeting of national ethics committees which meets every 2 years. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics has for a long time represented the UK at that meeting, so it seemed unusual. So, as it were, de facto, it had the role of a national ethics committee, and it seemed odd that at the time when an unprecedentedly large number of ethical questions around health were arising in a short space of time, and you had a body who've de facto been playing a role, who are sort of ready to go and say, well, look, effectively to tell us what you want to think about, anything you want us to provide advice on. That offer was not taken up, and even when an attempt was made to draw attention to the fact that the government had not articulated ethical principles or explained what it was doing in ethical terms, even when that nudge was given, that the fact that no response was forthcoming from the government, to my mind, it seemed to speak volumes, or at least it seemed to speak for itself.
Thank you.
Could I say one more thing in response to the earlier part of your question? Yes. You did mention that there was something which, in fact, Professor Parker was a member of, which was the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. And I mean, as I understand it, that group was actually set up initially to advise on questions that might have arisen were a no-deal Brexit to have occurred. And it just so happened it had been sort of set up and then sort of rolled over a few months to a year later when the actual pandemic occurred. And it sort of I got the impression that the chief medical officer, this is from reading the minutes, that the chief medical officer may have sort of used it as a sounding board, or said, well, give me some ideas about what somebody might say about this. But it was specifically not asked with providing sort of advice on what should or should not be done. Any sort of more vague advice that it provided was not published for quite a long time, in many cases not till 18 months after the advice had been given. So whatever it was for, it wasn't fulfilling that role that one might have hoped for of a body pursuing sort of ethical debate at a high and rigorous level in public, in a way that might have informed both public debate and government thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the analysis, but there was one example of where MEAG, as it got to be known, did have a relationship with, I think with SAGE. So this was, they did do some work on immunity certification and the ethics around that sort of the passport question, and they wrote a paper which was submitted. I'm not sure where it went after that, but it was certainly considered. So there was a bit of relationship, and Professor Sir Jonathan Montgomery was sort of keen to build that. So I think they had a bit more success, to be honest, than the Nuffield Council, but not much success. That was essentially a sort of diversity. Really, there was one meeting in late 2019 in person, and then everything is where we essentially were just introduced to each other, and then the whole thing switched online. But essentially, the members of that group were faith group leaders, for example, from various representatives of different kinds of communities.
Thank you. Professor Miles, you, in your response, indicate that the articulation of the various legal rights is beyond your ken, as we would say here, but you do indicate in answer to the second question, which I'm straying into, that there were obviously certain rights which were either hard rights or soft rights, however one wants to put it, that you would have expected from an economist's perspective to be considered. Could you give us some indication of those, please?
Well, I'm wary about delving into an area. I'm not a professor of philosophy or jurisprudence or professor of law. But just a point on rights, if I may. It strikes me as one question one might always ask about rights, which I think was asked earlier, which is, well, whose obligation is it to preserve those rights? what resources do they have to do so? To what extent can the person who has the duty or the obligation to see a right that someone else has fulfilled, to what extent is there only a limited ability to see that right fulfilled? And in a sense, I think it always is limited. And that's why I think, and I agree with others, when they say that rights, almost all the rights that we've talked about are not really absolute. I mean, even the right to life. I mean, I'm not sure whose obligation there is to see that everybody has that right. And so it seems to me that when we're talking about rights, maybe what we mean is a right that people have for that right to be taken into account and taken seriously, but not in almost all cases an absolute right. And of course, as I've said, I mean, these rights butt up against each other, and sometimes they can be in conflict, and that's particularly true during emergencies, medical emergencies such as COVID. Could I make a point about ethics?
Please do.
If I might. It seems to me that many of the difficult issues in the decisions made about how to deal with COVID raise obvious but very difficult ethical issues, partly because many of the restrictions that were imposed had significant costs on people for whom the risks of COVID were, to them personally, actually relatively low. I mean, children, for example, who weren't able to go to school for long periods of time, are going to, at the time and into the future, will suffer from that. And yet the risks for them individually of COVID were relatively low. That's probably true of young adults as well. It's true of people who are running their own businesses who simply had to shut down for periods. Other groups of people found the restrictions, relatively much easier to deal with. Perhaps some of those people were a little bit older, they had more resources, they were better off. And for them, it may well have been that the reduction in the risks of COVID actually was substantially more valuable to them than the cost of the restrictions. And in a sense, I think you could have predicted who these groups might be right from the outset. So there was also a difference in the timing of when costs and benefits came through. That's particularly obvious for young people whose education was disrupted, the costs of which will play out over potentially decades to come. And so there are questions there about discounting and future costs versus current and immediate costs, as well as ethical issues about actions which clearly are net detrimental to one group but net of an advantage to another. And those seem to me to be difficult because they involve interpersonal comparisons of welfare, ethical issues. On the time one, I think I've just repeat a point that I made earlier. Perhaps for understandable reasons, politicians, I think their time horizons shrank enormously during COVID. And that may be part of the reason why I think the actions were taken which, not just in retrospect, but I think at the time, just didn't pay enough attention to costs because they tended to come in the future.
Again, can I ask you, perhaps, again, it's a question straying on to the next question that's posed for you all as experts. The time constraints and the very difficult questions that were having to be answered, and is that, or do you think that that is a possible get out for not answering and considering those questions?
If I may. I don't think it's much of a get-out, because I think some of those ethical questions were pretty clear. I think some of the costs which were going to come largely in the future were also clear, and it wasn't a question of we haven't got time to even think about those now. I think it was more a decision we're concerned about things that are happening right now, and we will respond to those things and not consider things that are to a significant extent predictable but will happen in the future. It was, whether it was a conscious decision or not, I don't know, but I mean, that's what seemed to me to happen.
Do you have any comment to make on the, we'll put it this way, the advisability of such a prioritization of issues before decision makers? It seems rather, I'm sorry, it seems rather as if you're suggesting that this is our immediate concern. Consequences, we'll deal with those at a later stage. I mean, I may be probably putting it very simplistically. Well, is that a reasonable approach to take?
No, I don't think it is, because one can say we'll deal with that in the future, but if it's predictable that it's going to be very costly to deal with it, then to just say, well, we will think about that some other point is, bordering on irresponsible. And so some of the issues, pretty clearly in the case of the disruption of the education of young people, to say, well, we'll just deal with that later, sort of makes it sound like this is a minor thing that we can sort out easily. On just a purely economic front, to spend £150 billion on the furlough scheme, support for self-employed people and some support for some businesses, and to pretend that that was going to be easy to deal with in the future when the bill has to be paid. We'll be paying the bill for a very long time, And as I think I said this morning, that is already involving difficult decisions about resources going into health and education and dealing with waiting lists that expanded enormously in the National Health Service, expanded enormously during the period when hospitals were essentially, closed. And they are enormously difficult to deal with. There's been no very substantial fall in the waiting lists in the NHS, which I think in England went from 4 million people waiting for procedures to almost 8 million, and is still well above 7 million. And no sign of it coming down very far soon, unless the government can find lots more resources to put in the health system, which they can't because of the fiscal targets.
Yes, thank you. Professor Kearney, can I turn to you and have your comments on, perhaps going back to where we started this conversation, the hard and soft rights that a government and a decision maker should take into account when faced with something like the COVID pandemic. Your comments, please.
Yeah. So I find that distinction useful. Also the grammar. I think the grammar is often the government must do this, the government should do this, or the government could do this, which I guess is what the inquiry would focus on as well. And it then, I think, as soon as you think of those three distinctions, it connects quite strongly to other principles of effective government. Just more broadly about how it should work and how you know if it's going well, that sort of thing. So I looked through my previous report just to see what kind of references people would make to that in relation to rights. And there are some, I think it is largely what we've been talking about, but one additional thing would be, in terms of a reference to equality, broadly defined, or equity, there's this double emphasis on essentially how would you know if you were treating people equally without gathering data on it. So I think, you know, education is probably a good example where, well, before I go into that, I think when I've been looking at comparative work, I think it's starker in countries like the US where there are two ways to think of equality. One is in terms of provable discrimination, and the other is about using data to identify patterns of inequalities. And I think my impression is in the US, you can't make public policy based on patterns. You have to make it based on discrimination. So that's where people get into trouble in terms of trying to redress inequalities through schemes that only apply to some people, that they're legally challenged and such like. And so I don't get the impression the UK is quite like that, but there is this thing about there's some emphasis on, is there a direct evidence of discrimination in any of these choices? So I think like school closures, I don't think anyone at the time would have said, okay, by closing schools it's discriminatory. But a quick tracking of data showed that there were profound inequalities in terms of who could adapt to that decision well or not. And so the two things go together in public policy where to ensure equality, you first address discrimination and then you address the patterns of behaviour or outcomes that arise from these decisions, which is fantastically difficult. But I think that is one commitment that comes with these duties. It's to monitor what the impacts of policy to make sure you can learn and address any imbalances. So I think that does connect with, often people connect that to harder duties. So, for example, to gathering data is required as part of, I'm very hesitant now, I'm not a legal scholar, I think we all have to say this, don't we? But the Equality Act 2010 and the Public Sector Equality Duty, I think there's a duty to gather data to some extent on the impact of policy. So I think there is a connection there. In terms of proportionality, I think the examples people give would be in terms of not only enforcing stay-at-home orders, but the role of the police force and, you know, policing by consent, that sort of thing. I think other issues that I'm just looking out for issues that haven't come up yet in terms of the idea of autonomy. So I see in a report for this inquiry, there's a focus on the extent to which DNR or do not resuscitate requirements now have a much more explicit human rights approach within how they're treated. And then just for the political science of it, I think there are obligations in terms of how we envisage meaningful representation of citizens in these decisions. So I think the obvious one would be that people should be represented via Parliament. So there's a duty on government to keep Parliament informed and consulted on the changes it makes. And I think that was a key issue with UK and Scottish Government about the extent to which they gave Parliament enough information and time to process it. And then there's a separate concern with representation via engagement directly with citizens and stakeholders. And I think with that wider definition, I think in health, I think there's more of a focus on equity or human rights. But if we were talking about climate change, for example, it would be more of a language of justice, which would be not only distributional justice, but also procedural and recognitional. You know, so there has to be a just process to identify who should be included in any deliberations, and justice in terms of the rules that people use to make decisions. So I think all of those things come up. The final one would be that I think we've touched on health as a human right. I think that basic premise underpins all sort of public health discourse on equality. The starting point is health as a human right. Therefore, we assess all public policy with that lens. You know, to what extent does it live up to that basic principle?
Right, thank you very much. I'm sure everybody appreciates that this is a particularly important element, and we will go on in a moment to what may be seen to be an even more important element, which is the balancing on trade-offs. But just before we go into that, can I ask around the table if any of you have a particular point that you would wish to make, having heard the contributions of your colleagues. Professor Parker, I'll begin with you. Is there anything you would add to what you've already said?
I don't think so, really, to be honest. I think the things I would say would be to do with the ethics, and we'll come on to that in a moment.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Professor Wilson?
Likewise.
Likewise. Professor Busby?
Yeah, just a quick point, actually, and it relates to, I think Professor Miles put it well when he said that we might look at the right to have the right to be taken seriously when we're looking at the broad framework of human rights. And I think that's an important point. And I also think that that might play out in some of the contexts in which Professor Kearney spoke there about everyday decisions that are made about people's lives, not just in moments of national health emergencies, but in everyday life, through processes like the public sector equality duty. So those positive duties, which might not have the same kind of legal enforceability that for want of a better term, those hard rights that we mentioned earlier on have, but which in my mind are equally important in the way in which decision makers act on a day-to-day basis. And I think emphasis, we might come back to that, I think, later on, but I think emphasis there is really important when we're thinking about rights frameworks generally, because that is where the action happens, frankly. So if we're thinking about a human rights-based approach to positive duties, I think we do need to make sure that decision makers who do those everyday jobs, everyday decisions in terms of the police officer, the teacher, the social worker, are fully aware of the obligations that they have in terms of taking that human rights-based approach to protect and fulfil certain obligations under that human rights framework. So in some respects, it's of equal importance, if not in a day-to-day basis, of more importance, that emphasis is placed there in terms of information sharing and so on around preparation, perhaps, for a future health emergency.
Can I ask you, just following on from what you've just said, do you feel that in the current climate that there is a particular need now to emphasize to decision makers that those elements that they either require to or should take into account?
Yes, I think there is, and I think we could be better in Scotland and elsewhere at upholding what the public sector equality duty, to use that as an example, is intended to do. I think policy decision makers, duty bearers will say, I know I have duties under that particular provision, but I don't really know how to fulfil those adequately. And I think we could be better at training, guidance, messaging around that, and making sure that people have the information that they need in order to uphold those duties and make the right decisions in line with them.
Thank you very much. Lord Sumption, could I come to you? Having heard your colleagues, do you have anything that you would want to add?
I agree with what has been said. I would only add this. I have misgivings about the notion that ethical advice can ever be a separate stream in the decision-making process. I think it should be an integral part of the mental furniture of every advisor and every decision maker. A factor, in other words, in the advice given by the epidemiologists, the economists, the educationalists, and so on. The reason is simply that the ethical answer to a question will hardly ever be, you can't do this or you must do that. Ethics influences the answer to the question, how extreme do things have to be before we can resort to this or that measure of public health, given the downside. And so it seems to me it's an integral part of the original advice and not something which, as happens apparently in Germany, you can simply bring in later as a sign of corrective.
Thank you. Professor Miles, any further comment that you would wish to make?
No.
No. And Professor Kearney, is there anything? You had the final word on a few moments ago, so unless there's anything else that you would like to say.
Just very briefly, I mean, I know we're having a very useful general discussion, and a lot of the discussion of rights seems universal. I think the issue here is that it's difficult to know where the responsibility starts and stops to uphold those rights in a devolved system. So I don't envy anyone trying to unpick identifying broad rights and then saying this government is responsible for this aspect and that government is responsible for that. There is this wider issue about the coherence of the delivery of rights when many parts of government are responsible for delivery. I think that's probably, there's a fundamental problem there, that there might be a highly coherent, high-level approach, like a human rights approach with the Scottish Government, but it does not translate into anything coherent in terms of however all their actions fit together.
And I think it's just coming to the time for a break.
Right now. Very good. We'll take the break and just come back very shortly before the hour. Thank you. Now, when you're ready, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, my Lord. I'd like to move now to consider the ethical value judgments and the trade-offs that a government is likely to have to wrestle with in the context of something, a health emergency such as the COVID pandemic. But first of all, I'd like to ask Lord Sumption, if I may, because those of us who have read his books and the chapters within his books will know his view on, avoid the use of the word lockdown, but the blanket restrictions. Could you give us an indication of your views and your approach to your conclusion on lockdown, having regard to the various value judgments and trade-offs that we require to make?
Well, the starting point is, I think, that I do not believe that liberty is an absolute value. There are people who believe that. I'm not one of them. But I think that it is a value of very considerable importance. It is, looking at matters in the broadest philosophical terms, it's part of the respect for each other's autonomy that I think that we all owe to each other. I think that social contact is a basic feature of human society. It's a condition of our intellectual and cultural creativity. It's necessary for our well-being. It is therefore something that should be restricted only in fairly extreme circumstances. I think that the first requirement, therefore, is that before making any radical measures of the sort that we have seen, any government should consider all relevant factors and have a reasonably clear idea of what the consequences of different approaches may be. And that, I think, means that they have to consider, in addition to the epidemiological factors, they have to consider, first of all, the potential damage which is liable to be caused to people suffering from conditions, health conditions other than COVID-19, conditions whose diagnosis or treatment may have been adversely affected by lockdowns. And that in particular applies to mental health, to dementia, to cancer, to ischemic heart disease, dental problems, and many kinds of elective surgery. Secondly, I think that it is absolutely essential to consider the full range of other societal problems, including the economic implications, the financial implications, the educational and the social problems associated with some NPIs, in particular lockdowns. I feel very strongly the same way as Professor Miles did in an answer that he gave a few minutes before we adjourned, that these things should be taken into account. They cannot sensibly be parked for future consideration, because that assumes that the adverse effects of lockdowns can be undone by some straightforward procedure afterwards, and that is usually not the case. Thirdly, I think it is absolutely essential to consider less restrictive alternatives which give appropriate weight to all of those factors. That is not just, as it seems to me, an important element of ethical and efficacious decision-making. It is also, as it happens, an important legal consideration, because one of the critical elements of any decision about whether a decision is a proportionate departure from one of the prima facie rights conferred by the Human Rights Convention, one of the most important factors in that decision is, were there less intrusive available remedies or alternatives which gave appropriate weight to the object which was to be achieved? I believe that there were, and I think that the failure even to consider those points, certainly in England, I'm not in a position to say how far that was also true in Scotland, was a very serious failure of government.
Thank you. Do you anticipate, can you contemplate a situation where lockdown might be the only alternative available?
Yes, I think I can. Conceptually, there must be such cases. They will be particularly rare. A good example of a pathogen which was almost invariably mortal was Ebola. But Ebola had such a rapid period of time between contracting the disease and death that there was really almost nothing that one could do about it. So that's not, in fact, a very good example. But if you can imagine something which was almost 100% mortal, but allowed a sufficient delay to enable some measures to be taken, that might be an example. But one is speculating. The answer to your question is it conceivable that such a case might arise? The answer to that question is yes, it is. This wasn't one.
Can I also ask you if the requirements of the lockdown that we experienced in the UK, do you consider that offended against all norms of behaviour, and in particular was imposed on us concepts and requirements or restrictions that were alien to the wider geographic reference, the British consciousness?
I think that that lockdowns were an assault on some of the most basic instincts of humanity, of a kind which could only be justified in the most extreme cases and after considering all the factors that I have just mentioned and taking them into account. Mm-hmm. Because that didn't happen, the answer is that I do take that view, yes.
Yes, okay. Can I take you back to the early days of the pandemic? I would hesitate to ask you about your thought processes, as I don't think I'm in any capacity to deal on a level playing field with that. But did you, at the early stages of the pandemic, entertain these same views as to the desirability or potential efficacy of lockdown?
Yes, I did. The first thing that, like many other people, I didn't expect a lockdown to be imposed. And when it was, I did a lot of reading, both into official sources and more generally. I expressed very much the views that I have just expressed to you in a broadcast on the World at 1 at the beginning of April. Everything that has happened since has tended to bear out the concern which I expressed on that occasion, that this would have long-term costs, costs not just in financial but in societal and economic terms, which were not being taken into account and which were likely to be extremely serious.
Thank you. Yes. One of the concerns, I suppose, is that in expressing that view, you might be regarded as possibly an outlier in commenting in that way. And I think I noticed in your first comment on this, which was the lecture that is reproduced in the first of your books that I refer to, that you considered the word libertarian as being akin to a term of abuse. Can I just again ask whether you, as time has gone on and you've had an opportunity to reflect on that, whether you, do you have any comment on it?
Well, I think that most people, when they talk of libertarians, believe that they're talking about people who attach importance to liberty so extreme as to outweigh all other considerations. I do not belong to that school at all. As to whether I might be thought an outlier, I undoubtedly was an outlier. As time went on, I became less of an outlier, but I think that my view, looking at public opinion as a whole, remained a minority view for a very long time.
Has that changed so far as your view, your opinion, your understanding of the public view?
I think that most people who have gone into the subject in detail have expressed at least a measure of agreement with the points that I have been making.
Thank you very much. With that, against that background and that expression of view, can I turn to discuss with you the nature of the ethical judgments and the trade-offs that one has to make, assuming that one goes down the route of lockdown. And again, we probably have touched on this, and I may be asking you to repeat information you've already given to the inquiry. But Professor Wilson, Professor Parker, can I begin with you?
I mean, I think Lord Sumption's set out the majority of those issues. I mean, people would place different emphases and weights on these considerations, and I think that in itself is an important question. So I think, particularly in regard to the idea of lockdown, I think we would probably have a lot in common, actually, and I think I largely agree. But one of the issues that we've had to increasingly deal with, both before, during, and since the pandemic, is the fact that there is a large degree of polarisation in the country, and so there's a very wide range of values and views on these things. And one of the things we need to do better, we need to find ways of having conversations that are productive, and that are not necessarily always about achieving consensus, because that's not going to work. But nonetheless, we need to work through these problems in a way that is productive and capable of dealing with much wider ranges of views, I think, than perhaps we had before. So one of the most important ethical questions is, how do we do that? And the decisions that were made at the time of the first lockdown, which, as I say, I wasn't involved in. One of the things I would expect of a process is that reasons would be given. Alternative courses of action would be described, relevant facts displayed and considered, and judgments made which were clearly expressed, in the knowledge that decision makers, policy makers, and so on would be held to account at some point in the future. So justification, I think, is important, and I think that wasn't the case explicitly at the time of the first lockdown. Essentially, as a member of the public at that time, we were essentially told, essentially, this is what we require you to do, and it was a difficult situation, but I would have wanted more explicit acknowledgement of value differences, uncertainty, and nonetheless, I would expect my elected politicians and health professional, chief medical officers and others to make a judgment and say, this is what we're going to do, but I would have expected more explicit reasoning and an acknowledgement of the fact that this was a judgment. I don't think it's simply a matter of weighing. I think weighing is sometimes a kind of odd metaphor. It's about in the context of all relevant considerations, making a judgment, being willing to stand by that judgment and acknowledge that others may have different views, and that requires political strength and courage. I'm trying to think of things which haven't been said. I think one of the things that's often said in the context of public health ethics is that the main tension is between the well-being of the population, saving lives and avoiding health risks on the one hand, and questions of autonomy on the other, which I think is true to some extent. So questions of privacy and liberty to some extent on one side, and social benefits or avoiding harms on the other. I think there are important questions of justice, which I won't go, and equity, which were discussed earlier. So, but I think those are all important. But I think there may well be cases where principles or commitments on either side of that tension actually can be in tension. So one example, I think, which is likely and to have happened and will happen in the future, is the tension between privacy and liberty. So it may well be, for example, that the gathering of certain kinds of information, the sharing of certain kinds of information, whether it's through a contact tracing app or some other means, may be a way of having more intelligent decision-making processes around restrictions. So it may well be, so I'm not advocating one way or the other, but I think there may well actually be, it's not always the case that liberty and privacy as components of autonomy sit on one side. There may be occasions where you get more liberty if you're willing to give up a bit of privacy, and vice versa.
As the debate has perhaps advanced over the last couple of years, and the impression one gets is that it has, do you feel that there would now be, were we to have a similar situation, that there would now be greater questioning of the need for lockdown?
I can see why we're focusing on lockdowns, but I like the idea of thinking, well, actually, there are a range of interventions that might be possible of different degrees of severity and broad, application. So, but nonetheless, I would hope that there would be more questioning, but I would hope that, I agree that these things ought to be sort of the very last thing one gets to. There's a whole range of other things. But in principle, I would hope that the case could be, if it were needed, the case could be made in a way which is, coherent, explicit, and a lockdown could be described in a way which the relevant group, say whether it's population-wide or some particular more narrow group, would be, it's a bit like a court case when it kind of goes against you. You think, okay, you kind of, sometimes you have to accept that you didn't get your own way, and I think, that depends on a certain amount of confidence in the system to some degree.
Well, as lawyers, we all understand that situation. Interested in just something you said, and perhaps you said en passant, and I'll just go back to it. And I may have misunderstood you, but and correct me if I'm wrong. You indicated that lockdown, and I use that expression advisedly now, but lockdown should be seen as perhaps the most, or towards the most extreme end of NPIs, and that there should be discussion around alternatives. Now, is that the case that if there is a less, use the word draconian, alternative to lockdown, then that should be preferred?
Yeah, I mean, I'm essentially, I'm essentially a liberal. I think that imposing, restricting people's liberty in this context requires justification. I may be more willing to be convinced, perhaps, than Lord Sumption on occasion, but I think that's right. And so then there are two considerations here. One is the goal has to be one that's of value, saving lives, reducing risks to life and so on, and medical health risks. And there is a question there about, well, okay, what is the goal? And I think one needs clarity about that, because we might, as others mentioned earlier, the right to life under certain circumstances may be outweighed by other things, and as one gets the impact of the pathogen gets lower, we might question that. So one question is, what's the goal? And then the second question is, what's the minimum level of restriction on liberty that will achieve that goal? So, and I think, the ladder of, as it were, of public health interventions, each step up the ladder requires greater justification.
And interestingly, you use the word pose the question of what is the goal. So far as the COVID pandemic is concerned, in the early days, what did you understand to be the goal?
Well, I was a member of the public at the time. So,
yes. Well,
like everyone
an
else,
informed member of the public. Then what would you believe to have been the goal?
And we all, were looking at what was happening in Italy and Southeast Asia and so on. So, for me, it was about. This certainly felt like it was presented as an emergency, which then. There are differences between the kind of emergency that we have and the kind of emergency where someone, lies bleeding on the floor, where we do give up other things, we just try to help, and it sometimes was presented as that kind of emergency. We have to. There's no other considerations need to be set aside because saving lives here is what matters, and we all need to do what's required. I suppose that's the way. That's the message I guess I got.
Professor Wilson, your comments, please.
So, to start with the last question about what the goal was,
yes.
I think that often there did seem to be a degree of ambiguity around that, and I mean some of the way that the government messages at the time suggested that the goal appeared to be mitigation, the idea of sort of spreading the cases out over time so that the health system was not overwhelmed, but that at other times, and certainly from the Scottish government, some of the documents suggest that the goal was a more ambitious one of suppression, i.e. trying to reduce the cases, the number of cases that there were down to as low as possible, and that depending on what your goal is, then different sort of levels of severity of non-pharmaceutical interventions will be required. And certainly, if you wanted to go for something like a suppression policy, then something quite draconian would be required in order to bring about that policy. It might be that sort of realising how draconian those measures would be, you might think, well, maybe that was the wrong policy overall. But that in order to have a sensible ethical discussion about whether an NPI is proportionate, then you need to know, well, what's the goal? If you don't know what the goal is, it's difficult to have a sensible discussion about proportionality. It seems to me.
Interesting. Thank you, Professor Busby. Can we look at this in terms of the, whether one calls it trade-offs or balances of the various rights? There may be a tendency to think that this is insoluble. Is it insoluble in your view? And is it something that one should not avoid answering by saying it is insoluble?
Well, is it insoluble? No, I don't think it is. But even if it is, I think we still have to attempt to answer it. We still have to attempt to untangle the different obligations that are involved or implicated in this question. So if the goal, to come back to that point, whether we're talking about suppression or control, if the ultimate goal is preservation of life, either way, for whatever means you're attempting to do that, this is a difficult area in terms of trade-offs. But I would come back to the point that in the international law framework, and I'm using this in the sense of those fundamental principles for guidance that it will provide or might provide, does give guidance here that might assist decision makers and others. So if we think about that framework, interventions which require limitations of and derogations from human rights protections are exceptional, and their use must comply with certain specified criteria. And although they remain the prerogative of the state under, as Lord Sumption has highlighted, the margin of appreciation, they should only be exercised during public emergencies, and a threat to the life of a nation would be one of those such emergencies. Such use does not in itself contradict the engagement of or the enjoyment, sorry, and application of human rights itself, it might contribute to their effective protection in conformance with states' positive obligations to protect those rights, which in certain circumstances might justify derogations, for example, from rights to liberty and security, if we're weighing, and I think weighing is probably the wrong word to use, if we're considering the right to life, preservation of life against those rights to liberty and security. I think we have to think about that in the round, and we have to think about, and I know that we're usually dealing with these decisions in an environment of uncertainty, but we have to, as far as we can be certain, make sure that we're making the right decisions on the basis of those different considerations. And I think, so things like freedom of religion, for example, which might be restricted if we say, and I'll use the example of lockdown, you can't leave your home except within very limited circumstances, or the right to private and family life, which also might be restricted, certain other rights to liberty, as a way of realising, if you like, the Article 2 right to life, might be justified. But we do need to think about, and others have said this already, the implications of that in that wider context. Is it going to work? What are the costs that will be exacted by doing those things and limiting those other rights that people are entitled to expect, and so on? And I think in that regard, transparency and the sharing of information on which decisions are based may help with public understanding. So I'll come back to the point we made this morning, I think. In preparing for future actions, I think, importantly, we have to involve stakeholders in some kind of roadmap or action plan for what might need to happen in a health emergency as the only way of building confidence that I can think of in those sorts of actions, and running perhaps, it might be about that detailed reasoning that's been referred to already, different hypotheses, different scenarios, and giving people the opportunity to respond to those. If this happened and you were expected to do this, how would you feel? How would you be able to act? Would you be able to comply with that requirement in your current life circumstances? These are important questions, and I do think that where we want to know how things are going to play out in real time when we get to that health emergency, the best way to have advanced knowledge of that is to ask people, to involve stakeholders in the wider sense, in the sorts of plans that we might be making going forward. So I think, it's a difficult area. There are trade-offs that need to be made, but I think that a full consideration should be given to what those trade-offs are. And actually, if we're accepting and going along with the requirements of the international law framework in that loose sense, there are actually quite clear guidelines about what you can and can't and should and shouldn't do. And I think they're there for very good reason. And we should perhaps in the future take more notice of them than perhaps has been done in the past.
Okay. It's perhaps a practical question. Involvement of stakeholders. Do you see any difficulty? That's probably something for all around the table to consider. Do you see any difficulty in bringing together a sufficient number of stakeholders into the room, as I've termed it, in the early days of reacting to a pandemic?
Yes, I think I think they should be consulted, but I think it's too late in the process.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the pandemic, these are steps that need to be taken in preparation for, in that preparedness for what might happen in the future. And there are already good examples of using lived experience panels and so on to ask their views, their experience, their reactions to different types of action, different types of policy making. And I think that might be something that can and should be done. And we see already in the responses to this inquiry, the wide range of representative organisations that we have in Scotland who engage directly with their constituencies, their various constituencies across the whole of civil society. I think they have given good evidence to this inquiry, and I think that, again, there's involvement there that could be perhaps encouraged and facilitated in preparing for the next time.
We'll come to the perhaps the mechanics of how that might be done in response to other questions. So far as the involvement of stakeholders is concerned, how do you see that being organised, being truly representative of the range of stakeholders? Is this, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but is this a talking shop? Is it a body with some teeth that can be, whose view is particularly respected and adhered to? Is that how that could be done?
I think the latter, and I think you want to avoid a talking shop. I think people have consultation fatigue sometimes, where they're asked too many times to give views on sometimes the same issues that they've already provided views on. And I hear that from stakeholders in different contexts. So I think, careful thought has to be given in terms of how that might feed into policy making. But I think there is definitely a part for it to play in that wider decision making. And in particular, in terms of learning the lessons from the last pandemic and how that played out in people's real lives and the real impacts that it had. We can go so far, and I think we should, by taking account of the research that we alluded to earlier on that has been done, wide-ranging research, but actually I think, yes, views should be sought from members of the public, and I think not in a talking shop, but in an informed, participative way. How that happens, well, maybe we come back to that later. It's challenging. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I think it is important.
Okay. Professor Miles, you have told us in your answer that you, as the response to the pandemic progressed, came to the view that I'll put it crudely, the benefits of lockdown were being outweighed by the potential downside of lockdown, the actual or potential downside of lockdown. Could you explain how you came to that view? Well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Around about the end of May, beginning of June of 2020, I sort of undertook a bit of analysis of an attempt to try and quantify some of the trade-offs that we've been talking about in terms of restrictions, perhaps reducing the spread of the virus, saving lives versus the costs, some of which will accrue far into the future, some of which were more or less immediate. And I did that with a couple of other people over the course of, I guess it was May and June and into July, by which time, by about the middle of June, I think, in England and Wales, the restrictions had been substantially eased. So people talk about the first lockdown lasting around about 3 months from mid-late March to the middle of June. So the question became a rather narrow one, which was whether the scale of restrictions that had been imposed in that 3-odd month period generated benefits that were likely to be in excess or about equal to or lower than the costs. And that's rather a difficult, ethically rather a difficult calculation to make, but maybe I could just explain very briefly how I went about that. I mean, the benefits are that the virus would have spread less rapidly and there would have been fewer deaths, essentially. And there's a range of estimates as to how many lives might have been saved. At the very high end would have been an estimate that without the lockdown, deaths might have been as high as 500,000 over a period of a few months. And the actual figure was very dramatically less than that. and one could attribute the whole of that difference, 450,000 saved lives, simply to lockdown. I think that's a highly implausible estimate, because, as we talked about earlier today, the very possibility that that might have happened, which was well understood, I think, by most people as we went through March, meant that people's behaviours were changing, and they were taking precautions themselves in the light of public health messages coming from the government. And that very high figure was based on an assumption that there was no changes in behaviour. So that's a sort of high-end number. A low-end number, as how many lives saved, would have been to look at the experience of countries where there were much fewer restrictions. Sweden is probably the primary example. Look at the number of deaths there, compare them with the UK. As it turned out, over that period, the deaths were not substantially different between Sweden and the UK. And that would have been a low-end estimate of what the extra restrictions brought you in the UK, or very, very little in terms of saved lives, and many points in between. So on the benefit side, calculated a range of rather morbid calculation of potential lives saved, and whose lives may have been saved in terms of the age of people and whether they had morbidities and, if you will, their expected rest of life if they hadn't had COVID. On the cost side, I think I made an effort to, whilst not understating the benefits in terms of lives saved, to not overstate the costs by not taking into account what I think actually are some of the very substantial long-run costs in terms of the cost of the education of young people being disrupted, the enormous increase in waiting lists in the health service, the fact that people weren't being scanned for conditions like cancer, and that was going to generate health costs down the road, and merely take a very narrow definition of costs in terms of the cost to livelihoods of people and lost incomes, and the cost of the government of trying to make up for lost incomes through schemes that cost the government a rather large amount of money. That still leaves you with the question, well, how do you make a comparison between, on the one hand, lives saved, and on the other, monetary values of things? And some people would say you simply can't bridge that gap, and that you cannot put a price on life. I think that's not consistent with, in fact, many decisions that governments make. And I think we mentioned this morning that, you could save more lives on the road if you reduce the speed limit on motorways to 20 miles an hour. And we don't do that because we all understand that there are very substantial costs of that, and the number of lives saved might be not trivial, but relatively low. And so we actually don't do that. So governments actually make decisions like that all the time. They're explicitly made in the National Health Service. And as many people around this table will know better than I do, there is actually a price put on the maximum that should be spent on a medical procedure, which is expected to generate one extra quality-adjusted life year for the person who receives the procedure or the drug, and that number is £30,000. So that gives you a very crude, and some people would say somewhat misleading, way of converting between lives saved and asking the question, how much resources would the UK government, using the nice as they are rules, if you will, on medical procedures, how much would you be prepared to spend medically to save that many lives that restrictions may have saved, and compare that with the monetary value of a subset of the costs of the restrictions. So that was the piece of analysis I did. It subsequently got published in a journal, and I've got a copy here, the National Institute Economic Review, in August of 2020. Okay. So it wasn't done a long time after the event. It was kind of analysis done almost as this was all playing out. And for what it's worth, those calculations suggested that the costs of the scale of the restrictions and how long they were kept in place looked to be out of line, sorry, the benefits rather, look to be out of line with the costs. And even if one used figures for the value of a quality adjusted extra year of life, which were 2 or 3 times the NICE guidelines which were actually used in the National Health Service at that time, even if you used a much higher value on quality adjusted life years saved, it was still quite difficult to match up against the costs, where the costs are measured as a subset of what I think were really the true costs in the long run of the restrictions. So the conclusion was that the restrictions were of a nature that generated very high costs and kept in place for longer than was probably warranted by the scale of benefits, given that people were taking their own view on the risks and adjusting their behaviour in a way which would have kept the deaths far beneath the assessment of 500,000, which was explicitly based on an assumption of no changes in behaviour. So that's a kind of summary of what the work I did at that time.
Can I take up a few points that you've made there? You began, I think, by saying that the calculation, and I'll probably do it a great disservice by referring it to it as that, but the calculation that you carried out was, as I noted you to say, ethically difficult.
Yeah.
Now, is that from the point of view of the factors that you had to input into that calculation, or is that in, I can put it probably very crudely, that you're carrying out what might seem to many people to be a somewhat distasteful exercise of balancing the value of life against the ongoing impact on probably generations to come?
Well, we used the guideline that was actually used for medical decisions within the NHS. So you could view this exercise as a test of the consistency of the policy, because that policy, in a sense, put a maximum value on something that increased by 1 year quality adjusted lives in the country. There are other ways that economists have used in different countries to value life. Some of them reflect survey questions of individuals, which almost come down to asking people the question, if we could do something, if you could do something, or something could be done to you which increased your life by 1 year, how much would you pay for it? Those numbers tend to come up with more than the £30,000 criteria used in the National Health Service. But even if we use those higher numbers, it still looked like the extra lives saved by lockdown didn't quite match up to even a fairly narrow subset of the costs of lockdown. But this is, I think it is an ethically difficult area, because you are asking a question about what value do you place upon an action that could be expected to increase by 1 year somebody's life in quality adjusted terms.
And I'll come to Professor Kearney in a moment on this for his view, but is that a decision which obviously requires to be made? In this context, it has precedent, obviously, in the context of health, benefits, and I think we've all experienced the cost analysis of that. But it obviously may require to be explained to the public. Now, from your view, is that, and you've now done it today, is that something that is difficult to explain? in that a public reaction may well be.
Yes.
If it's my relative,
Of
I
course.
can't put a price on that life.
Of course.
Is it a very, how can I put it, is it, from a public perspective, is it almost an unpalatable decision,
I think it
decision
is
to have to,
I
make?
think it is very difficult because people's instinctive reaction is to say you can't put a value on life.
Yeah.
You're trying to attach a pound value to giving someone an extra amount of life. I think it becomes more understandable for people if you say, as I think is true, that in some sense the monetary cost of the lost output of the government compensating people through the furlough scheme, which helped both people who were employed and people who were self-employed, and the support to businesses. If you say that those costs, if you add them together, some people put them as high as £300 billion for the UK. I would put them at least as high as 150 billion, which was explicitly the government's estimate of the cost of the furlough scheme, helping people in self-employment and supporting businesses through difficulties they had through lockdown. If you say to people that 150 billion pounds is money that could have been spent either at that time but it was actually borrowed, so it's going to have to be found to repay the debt in the future. That is money that will go into the health service, or could have gone into the health service, could have gone into education, could have gone into helping people with mental health problems, reintegrate them better into the rest of society, and so they can work and have a higher quality of life. They will end up affecting the quality and the length of life of people. And I think when you put things in those terms, it no longer becomes, oh, you're just concerned about money. As an economist, you just count money and you think you can equate that to lives. And I think people are much more willing to see the force of that point.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, I think you were one of the disadvantages of having a round-table discussion around a rectangular table is that I'm afraid I'm not looking in the right direction. So
thank you very much for
understanding
coming.
that Leonard Jr. tells me you would like to come in.
Yes, so I did read Professor Miles's paper, and I was surprised that the results of the analysis seemed to be so clearly to suggest that the lockdown had been poor value for money. And one thing that struck me is that one of the main reasons for that was that most of the people who died as a result of COVID were old. And so you assumed that as it were only 10 years of healthy life were saved by saving a life. And so that effectively then said, well, if each life saved is only 10 years because we assume people are old, then, as it were, if it's going to cost any more than £300,000 per life, then it would appear to be not worth doing. But there might be other ways to think about how we might want to value lives. And certainly, for example, in railway safety, the value people use is the value of preventing a fatality, where there's no assumption is made about the age of the person who will be saved as a result of improving safety on the railway. And there might be ethical reasons to think that was a better way to go about working out whether lockdown was good value for money. Or at least, if we want to adopt your approach, we have to be honest to say, well, it's because the people who died were mostly old that we didn't think it was good value for money.
Well, in a sense, though, that's what the nice rule pushes you toward. And it's not my rule, it's the rule for allocating resources in the NHS.
But that's precisely why people think it's ethically dubious. And it's not, in fact, used in the way that you suggest using it there, in the way that actually the NICE makes decisions about incremental cost effectiveness.
I mean, I have a great deal of sympathy with what you're saying, actually. And that's why there are calculations in the paper which says, well, how much higher than the quality number per year would you have to be using for it to be just about benefits, roughly equal costs, and therefore it was a sensible strategy. And I think they do have to be a lot higher.
it's rather an invidious topic, I accept that, but your rail calculation, I'm just interested, presumably the population that you're trying to protect are those that travel on trains, and they will not have the same sort of age profile as those suffering from or at risk from serious illness or death from COVID, I assume.
No, that's very true, but nonetheless, I think it's something like £2 million. But there's a figure that people use. They plug into it equations for if this is the value of preventing a fatality.
A death in the population, which has, well, it probably doesn't have the same chance of being a 5-year-old child as a 90-year-old man, but nevertheless, it will be a very different age profile from those that are at risk or higher risk. From COVID.
Indeed, that's correct. But maybe my thought was that a different way of valuing a life is to say that we put, for public policy purposes, we put a set value on saving a human life, and when we don't delve into how old the people are or say that we should be willing to spend more on saving a young person than an old person.
I understand that. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Professor Wilson, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think these kind of calculations are really important to do, and I agree it's very difficult. I think a lot does depend on what the comparators that one uses. That's absolutely right. Within the NHS, there is. So that's the standard kind of amount, but that's really about distributing available resources rather than, So it's not really about how much we'd pay for life if we had more money. But even in that context, so we do, for example, pay, in some cases, like for example, enzyme replacement therapy, we're willing to pay up to £500,000 a year to save a life. And when a lone yachtsman gets lost in the middle of the Atlantic, we pay a huge amount. So the comparators that you choose are going to be very important, I think. Yeah.
If I may just very briefly on that.
Please do.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's a way of allocating scarce resources for whatever the NHS budget has been given. And if the NHS budgets were much bigger, then the 30,000 might become 45 or 50 or 100 or, a much bigger number. Of course, it's not completely random how many resources go into the NHS. I mean, that's a government making a political decision, a government that got voted for, between different alternative uses of limited resources. Education, all that stuff. So it's not arbitrary how many resources are in the NHS. That's a political and, in some sense, ethical judgment itself.
Yeah, sure.
I'll come back to that. Professor Miles, can I just go to your figure of 150 billion in relation to the cost of furlough and other financial inputs into this. So far as that is concerned, and things with several noughts on the end of it just caused me to run a mile. But so far as that is concerned, what is the implication of that for the current generation going forward?
Well, it meant and it means that the stock of debt, since it wasn't covered by higher taxation, in fact, the cost of government was more than what they actually spent on furlough and on support to businesses, because the tax they would have normally expected to get from people who were working and were able to carry on working has to be added in as well as a cost. So you go quite a lot above 150 billion. Well, it means that at some point in the future you have to find 150 billion plus interest on 150 billion to return yourself to the path that you might have been on had you not gone down the road of large-scale support, which was necessitated really by the scale of restrictions. So you could spread that cost across many generations to come if you had the time to do that. And I say if one had the time, because the UK, and this is not unique to the UK, but the UK is now in a position where it has a stock of debt which is very high relative to its GDP. It's 100%. and that increased very substantially as a result of COVID. And you have to persuade people to lend you the money and to keep lending you the money as you roll over the debt if you try and postpone the date at which you have to pay it back in some sense. And given the government's, not just this government, but the previous government as well, their own fiscal rules and targets, they've, in a sense, begun to run out of road and have now got to try and run fiscal balance to stop the stock of debt rising even further. And that means very tight settlements on spending or substantial increase in taxes. And both of those things are likely to be necessary. And so it is going to affect, in a counterfactual world where none of that had happened, spending on health and education and defence and lots of other things would be higher than they will be.
Okay.
But by material amounts.
Professor Kearney, one of the issues that I've perhaps highlighted in the discussion so far has been the need to carry out the sort of assessment and calculation that Professor Miles has just referred to. I'm particularly interested in understanding from a political science point of view, the difficulty to carry, I won't say reluctance because I'm sure it isn't reluctance, but perhaps the difficulty in carrying out that assessment, and then the additional difficulty in communicating that to the public. So could you comment on those, please?
Yeah, I feel like I've stockpiled a lot of points here based on the discussion. Please bear with me.
Not at all, no.
So I think I would start with trying to piece together some of the things we've talked about all day, which some of it was about fear. So I think the emphasis was on fear among the public, but I think it's reasonable to expect there to be higher fear amongst the policymakers making these decisions. They're the ones who are receiving this information routinely and faced with, I think, an existential crisis that they couldn't fathom. The other is radical uncertainty, which is essentially if you were saying to someone, we're going to make you immensely fearful about what's going to happen. We're going to withhold almost all information about what's going to happen. Then we're going to ask you to make a calculus. Tell me what should be the price of a QALY and how much the public debt should be. I think the expectation exceeds the abilities of humans to make choices under those kind of conditions. So I think in terms of going back to that question about what did governments think they were doing, I think that, well, the strongest version of that would be they're receiving information that there could be an existential crisis. They could be facing a virus that causes a disease with a 1% fatality rate and harming many more people. At that level, it could devastate public services in health, education and more to the extent that they completely collapse. That would create a crisis of governance to which no government could reasonably recover, to the extent that it would be difficult to envisage a future beyond that crisis. And I think if that precedes their calculus, it changes the game. It switches it from a technical question of costs and benefits to something much more profound. So, I mean, that's okay. I do have some more humdrum points to connect to that, but I think that is the context that it's easy to forget now as we go back. But I think that was that's what people were experiencing, this moment in time when they were driven by fear as much as by information. I think in terms of the calculus, this allows me to let some governments off the hook, but certainly I think the UK government was largely uninterested in cost-benefit analysis during this period, in comparison with the Scottish Government, which was more interested, but after lockdown. So the Scottish Government had this so-called 4 harms framework. It could have been 2 or it could have been 6, but they went for 4, and it was a simple attempt to compare costs and benefits in a non-numerical manner. So their first harm was the direct harm of COVID-19. The second was other health harms caused by the pandemic, such as the allocation of healthcare resources. The third was societal harms associated with lockdown, social isolation, school closures and such like. And then the fourth was a bit of a combination, economic harms, both of COVID-19 and lockdown policies, which I think were hard to separate in practice. You know, what was it that was causing the harm? Was it the spread of infection, or was it the government's response? I think it was both, and I don't think we can separate the two very well. So maybe that's why that was number 4. And they kind of had a 5th harm, which they tried to mainstream throughout those 4, which was unequal harms in each case. So instead of having an explicit 5th harm, which is unequal, they went for those. But my impression is this was something that they developed much more to deal with the transition from lockdown rather than the lockdown itself. I think they were in the same position where they saw no alternative, no reason to consider costs and benefits in that level because they had already made the decisions. This was about how to shift from that position to another. But it still offers, the thing is the Scottish Government does so many things that they offer lots of learning that are interesting. Even if they don't go well, they do allow us to learn about what to advise next time. So, for example, they found it very difficult to translate that discussion of harms into concrete decisions. So they had advisory groups and they had other means to keep those harms on their agenda or to make sure that people paid reference to them in their decisions in a very general sense. But they found it difficult to then translate those considerations into a balance during choices. It's very hard to find out how it actually affected their deliberations. And that could be simply because they didn't publish them, but I think they have had lots of chances to do it, and I don't see it. The other thing that I think, this is more of an aside that we could follow up. The Scottish Government gives us a lot to learn about that question of who should engage and when and how and that sort of thing, because it is good at a form of stakeholder engagement, which is to signal a very strong commitment to it, which shouldn't be diminished. You know, I mean, compared to other governments, it expresses in principle that it matters. Then it engages. Then I think the tricky part is how to reconcile what happens with more dominant forms of effective government, which is, at the end of the day, a minister has to be accountable to Parliament for the choices they make, and stakeholders are not accountable. So it all comes down to a minister making a judgment from lots of different sources. And I think that's one of those black boxes that I think is difficult to open, where even ministers will say in their statements, the question, how did you weigh up all these ethical choices? And that sort of thing. I used my judgment. And that's it. And that is both a unsatisfying answer and a very satisfying answer, because I think that's what it comes down to in terms of we elect people to make these hard choices and use their judgment, and they probably don't know, they couldn't really explain how very well, but that's okay. But it's also unsatisfactory in it's very difficult to give them advice on how to provide a systematic way of helping them make those choices. So, I mean, okay. Yeah, I don't know what that all adds up to, but there you go.
Right, well, I think it adds up to a lot. Following that, can I put out to all members of the panel a point that you've made, and to a certain extent I alluded to, and indeed Assumption alluded to this morning, and that is fear in the public and a fear in public messaging. Now, we can look at this with hindsight, and to a certain extent it's inevitable to do that. Do you feel that there was something of an over-egging of the fear in the messaging that came from government at this time? I'm sorry, we're going around the table, or squarely around the table.
I think yes would be the short answer to that. And I guess insofar as the government is hoping that there'll be compliance with public health advice, maybe there are different ways of achieving that. One is effectively sort of to dial up the fear and hope, just in virtue of the fear that people will comply. And another way would be to explain why it is that would be beneficial for them, their families and their communities. And it seemed that we had a bit more of the fear in many cases, particularly from the UK government than the explanation. And that maybe one thing to reflect on is that fear may be good in the short term, but if you need to keep up people sort of complying, particularly with guidance as it changes over not just months but maybe a year or two, it's quite difficult to do that, and it may be sort of a more sort of agile public health strategy to, as it were, begin to sort of educate people about the nature of the risk, the viruses, the protections they can take, and how they might change it, so that they're more empowered to protect themselves and those they care about.
Okay. Mr. Parker.
Yeah, two things. So, firstly, on the politicians and decision makers feeling fear. I mean, I think, I want my decision makers to have an emotional life around these things, and I want, because that's a way of connecting them, I think, to people whose lives are outside. So I think that's a valuable thing. Yeah, I don't want them to be so frightened that they're paralysed and unable to make decisions, but nonetheless, it reassures me in a way that politicians are feeling similar types of things at least. There are times, and I think the beginning of the pandemic is one of them, where fear is perfectly reasonable and rational, sensible, kind of healthy kind of set of feelings to have. And so I don't think we should avoid that, but I do. The key question is, are the messages proportionate in that sense? So yes. Are they playing into fears to achieve some other aim? I think that's very problematic. I think underplaying, things which might lead normal, everyday people to feel afraid, I think is also wrong to some extent. I mean, there may be exceptional cases, but I do think that it's very important that we don't avoid those feelings and avoid communicating that this may well be a time when it's reasonable to feel a degree of anxiety. And I think that's, it's just sensible and kind of human, I guess.
Just on that, Professor Parker and indeed Professor Wilson, fear on the part of decision makers, and I take the point that perhaps gives them a connection with the general public, and the feeling of fear amongst members of the public. And Professor Kearney has talked about the existential crisis. Is it, or would it, in your views, be advantageous, that's probably an inappropriate word, but I'll use it, advantageous, to factor into this equation so that it is available to the public the impact that something such as lockdown may be projected to have on the generation going forward? We've heard in this inquiry a great deal of evidence of the impact on the schools and school children, and I think generally we know of the impact that there has been on the education of all sectors of those in learning. Also the financial impact that Professor Miles has talked about. from your perspectives, do you feel that that should have been made available as a balance to the information concerning the potential existential crisis that this pandemic brought?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I do think some of the normal political rules need to be set aside in some of these, and the political ways of behaving. I think there is a need just to be, this is a serious. We want our politicians to be serious, and to be honest, and to exhibit leadership whilst acknowledging that they may sometimes have got it wrong and they may need to change their view later on. These are very difficult things for politicians to do, but extraordinary situations require extraordinary means. And one could imagine a situation in which, let's say, Professor Miles's calculation would come out much closer, as it were, but nonetheless, perhaps slightly in favour of lockdown, but nonetheless, I think, so there was greater degree of uncertainty. I think it would be vital to have to say that and to say, look, this is a very difficult situation. This is the judgment we've come to, and there are uncertainties associated with it. I realise that's maybe idealistic, but that's nonetheless what should be done.
Maybe a difficulty in translating idealism into practicalities, but I take a point. Professor Wilson, do you have a comment to make?
Yeah, I would agree with what Professor Parker just said, but maybe one sort of broader thought about good communication in the pandemic has just been that governments need to be able to communicate in a way that sort of maintains and builds trust within citizens over time, and that particularly in a internet age, and given the ease of communication, it's very difficult for a government to attempt to maintain that trust on the basis of not being fully honest with the public about sort of potential downsides to any policy. If a policy needs to be taken if a decision needs to be taken very, very, very quickly, and there isn't time, then anyway, people might give the government a break. But insofar as the information is available to the government in the time it's factored into the government's decision, and it sort of weighed against the decision that was taken, it seems important that governments be able to acknowledge that and make it available to citizens, and that a good form of communication will be able to maintain trust over time. If government's able to show, well, despite the fact that there were considerations on the other side, we think that this particular course of action is overall in the public interest. It's not an easy thing for a government to do, but that seems one of the lessons of the pandemic, communication-wise, is that over the long term, that sort of approach is likely to maintain trust rather more than one in which a government only presents one side.
Yeah. I'd like to, I'm mindful of the hour as I approach our conclusion, on at least today. I'd like to ask Lord Sumption, having heard your fellow panellists, do you have any further comments that you would like us to bear in mind and to have regard to?
No, I think that the factors which have been discussed by everyone around the table are broadly the same factors that I attach importance to. On fear, I think the basic problem arises when governments use hard-hitting advertisements not to inform, but to induce compliance with policy decisions that they have already made, because that is going to mean, in this particular case, it meant, first of all, that some of the fear-mongering was actually not necessary, because an objective account of the facts would have induced people to comply with the lockdown anyway, but if not, to take reasonable care for themselves. Secondly, I think that it is that kind of hard-hitting advertisement is neither balanced nor objective. Thirdly, I fear that ultimately it is self-defeating for the reason just given, namely that if you press on with this line beyond a very short point, you end up by losing people's trust. People will feel exhausted by the message. The object lesson seems to me, again, to be Sweden, where a policy which was not consistent with that followed in almost every other European country was coherently justified by, in particular, Anders Tegnell, but not only by him. And although there was a fair amount of grumbling in Sweden, by and large, public opinion accepted what they were being told. And I think that is an object lesson in the fair, objective, and balanced presentation of information.
I'll just take one point from what you just said, Lord Sampson. You've given us the Swedish example, and we've heard, obviously, from Dr. Tegnell. And I know you comment on this, but I'd just like to have your perhaps expanded comment on this. And maybe a suggestion that the Swedish, if I can call it, psyche, is different to that in Britain, or that there are sufficient differences between Sweden and Great Britain that might lead one to conclude that the Swedish approach is something that is specifically Swedish or could be applied probably not beyond its borders. You, I think, have given a view on that, and I wonder if you'd just explain that, please.
Yes. First of all, I have never seen any convincing evidence to support the proposition that the English or Scottish public are psychologically different when faced with serious threats to their health to the Swedish government. I think that an instinct for self-preservation is arguably the most basic instinct of humanity. And if one's going to say that that instinct is in some way less developed or takes an eccentric form in the British Isles, I think it's incumbent upon you to produce some impressive evidence. And all I can say is that I haven't seen any. I would add this, which is that you can also compare that's what Sweden did with what other Scandinavian countries, Finland, Denmark, and Norway did. And the result of that comparison is that in the first year of the lockdown, the Swedish death toll was higher than that of the other three Scandinavian countries. This is largely a factor of timing. If you look at the thing over the whole period covered, you find that the results were pretty comparable. Now, it seems to me that if policies as different as that can produce very similar results, then I think you have to rethink the whole exercise. Recently, a book called In COVID's Wake concentrates on making the same comparison, mainly in the context of different policies pursued by different states in the United States, and has come up with a remarkably similar conclusion that NPIs over the whole period of the crisis do not make a significant difference to outcomes. You're probably aware of this already, but there is an extremely interesting and I think valuable review of the excess mortality in the 4 Scandinavian countries in the European Journal of Public Health, volume 34, page 737 and following, which is the fullest statistical analysis of the comparison that I know of. And it's also pretty well up to date.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I think perhaps a point to bring today's interesting discussion to an end.
Very good. Well, to all the panellists, thank you very much for an interesting day. We will commence again tomorrow at 9:30, I'm afraid. 9:30 tomorrow morning, ladies and gentlemen.
All right.
Very good.